Have you ever wondered, why does the hostility between the United States and Iran persist to this day? How did two nations that were once allies turn into adversaries, with hardly a year passing without their news dominating global headlines? Did the story begin with the hostage crisis, or are the roots of this conflict much deeper than most people believe? Behind this decades-long enmity, there are revolutions, coups, intelligence operations, and a secret military mission that no one was ever supposed to know about. A mission meticulously designed to be one of the most precise rescue operations in modern history. Yet, it ended in the middle of the Iranian desert before even reaching its target. In a single night, a plan described as near perfect turned into one of the most famous military failures in history. But the real question is, how did the United States and Iran arrive at this moment? And why do those events still cast their shadow over the relationship between the two countries today? This is the story of Operation Eagle Claw. To understand what happened that night deep within the Iranian desert, we must go back years in time, because the story of Operation Eagle Claw did not begin with helicopters, nor did it begin with the hostages. Rather, it began with a completely different relationship between Iran and the United States. This might seem strange to some today, but decades ago, Iran was not Washington's enemy. Instead, it was one of its most vital allies in the Middle East. Following the end of World War II, the world was divided into two major blocks: the United States on one side and the Soviet Union on the other. Thus began what would later be known as the Cold War, a global confrontation that relied less on direct military engagement and more on political, economic, and intelligence influence. And at the very heart of the Middle East, Iran occupied a highly critical strategic location. It bordered sensitive regions, possessed massive oil reserves, and served as a vital observation post monitoring the Soviet Union. For this reason, it became far more than just a friendly nation to Washington. It was an indispensable strategic partner. During that period, Iran was ruled by Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. The Shah sought to modernize his country rapidly. Iran witnessed massive construction projects, infrastructure expansion, and heavy investments in industry, education, and the military. But on the flip side, this rapid modernization was accompanied by growing discontent among broad segments of society. Opponents of the regime accused the government of restricting political freedoms and relying on powerful security apparatuses to suppress dissidents, while others felt the pace of change was too fast and failed to respect social and religious balances. As the years passed, the protests began to grow, and in late 1978, massive demonstrations erupted across various Iranian cities. The country was boiling. Every week brought larger protests than the week before. With mounting public pressure, it became clear that the regime was facing the most dangerous crisis in its history. In January 1979, the Shah left Iran. He believed his absence would be temporary, but he would never return to power. A few days later, Ruhollah Khomeini returned to Iran to a massive public reception, and an entirely new chapter in the country's history began. For many Iranians, the revolution marked the dawn of a new era. As for the United States, it was the beginning of a phase filled with ambiguity and uncertainty. The turning point. In the initial months following the revolution, relations between the two countries were tense, but they had not yet reached the point of no return. However, a single event changed everything. After leaving Iran, the Shah was permitted to enter the United States to receive medical treatment. In Iran, this decision sparked widespread outrage. Many believed Washington might be paving the way for the Shah's return, or at the very least, was still supporting him. Protests intensified outside the American embassy in Tehran. Then came the morning of November 4th, 1979. Hundreds of students gathered in front of the embassy compound. At first, it seemed like just another protest, but within minutes, some began scaling the walls and storming the compound. Inside the embassy, American staff tried to destroy classified documents as fast as possible. Some files were burned, others were shredded, but there wasn't enough time. Within hours, dozens of American diplomats and staff members were held captive inside the embassy. The incident quickly escalated into a hostage crisis that shook the world. Television screens broadcasted images of the embassy daily. Americans woke up every morning to the exact same question: when will the hostages come home? Days passed, then weeks, then months. Yet, the crisis did not end. Negotiations began, and international mediators intervened, but the hostages remained captive. With each passing day, pressure on the American administration mounted, and an idea that once seemed impossible gradually turned into a viable option. If diplomacy failed, could a special military force secretly enter Iran, rescue the hostages, and get out undetected? That question was the beginning of one of the most dangerous covert operations in modern history. The plan everyone thought was impossible as the American hostages entered their third month, then fourth, then fifth inside the embassy in Tehran. Washington was living through an unprecedented state of frustration. Every day that passed without progress in negotiations meant greater political pressure on the American administration. The American public was following the crisis moment by moment. The hostages' families appeared constantly in the media, demanding their return home, and at every press conference, the exact same question was repeated: when will you bring our boys back? In the beginning, the diplomatic option was the only hope. But as the months dragged on, American officials began to realize that negotiations could take a very long time and might not even succeed at all. That was when an idea that once seemed crazy began turning into an actual plan. What if a U.S. Special Operations Force secretly entered Iran, freed the hostages, and then left before anyone could stop them? But the mere thought of this idea was terrifying. The United States wasn't planning a military operation on the borders of a friendly nation, but rather deep inside one of the most volatile countries in the world at the time. Any minor mistake could ignite a full-scale military confrontation, and it could lead to the deaths of all the hostages. Nonetheless, the decision was made to begin planning. A mission never before executed. The mission was assigned to an elite U.S. Army Special Operations Force, while intelligence agencies began gathering every single piece of information that could be obtained about the Iranian capital. Satellite imagery alone was not enough. The planners needed to know everything: the width of the streets, the locations of checkpoints, the flow of traffic at night, the positions of Iranian forces, and even the nature of the desert sand that the force would cross. Every tiny detail could determine the success or failure of the operation, but the biggest problem was that the operation was not just a quick raid. It was a long chain of interconnected steps. If a single step failed, everything would collapse. The plan was like a row of dominoes. Each stage depended entirely on the success of the stage before it. On the designated night, U.S. military transport planes would take off from distant bases, carrying dozens of soldiers from Delta Force, one of the most secretive special operations units at the time. At the same time, 8 helicopters would take off from an American aircraft carrier stationed in the Arabian Sea. The planes and helicopters had to fly hundreds of kilometers over hostile territory, in pitch darkness, without being detected. After hours of flying, they were all supposed to meet at a secret rendezvous point deep in the Iranian desert, a place with no inhabitants, no military bases, not even any lights. The planners named this location Desert 1, and here the most dangerous phase would begin. What would happen at Desert 1? Upon arrival, the helicopters would refuel from the transport planes. After that, the force would hide throughout the daylight hours inside the desert until night fell once again. The following night, the helicopters would take off toward the outskirts of Tehran. As for the soldiers, they would move using civilian trucks prepared by undercover agents inside Iran. The goal was to reach the embassy without raising any suspicion. Meanwhile, another group would take control of a nearby military airfield. As soon as the hostages were freed, the helicopters would transport them to that airfield. Then, the transport planes would land there, allowing everyone to leave Iran within minutes. On paper, the plan looked brilliant. In fact, some military officials described it as one of the most complex rescue operations ever planned in history. But all of this success depended on just one thing: that every single step go with absolute precision. The problem no one anticipated. Despite the meticulous planning, there was an enemy that could not be controlled. Not the Iranian army, not the intelligence services, nor the radars, but rather the desert itself. Hundreds of kilometers of sand, winds that could whip up without warning, and dust storms that could completely blind visibility. The planners studied weather forecasts carefully, but the desert does not recognize forecasts, and this was the danger that many had not given enough attention to. The countdown. After long months of secret training, everything was ready. The helicopters, the planes, the special forces, the agents, and even the vehicles that would be used inside Iran. Nothing was left but to give the final order. On the evening of April 24th, 1980, the American aircraft took off toward one of the most dangerous missions in their history. The soldiers did not know that some of them would never return home, and the planners did not know that the operation, which took months of preparation, would begin to collapse before even reaching the Iranian capital. When the desert became the true enemy, the clock was approaching evening. In military bases hidden far from view, soldiers began boarding the aircraft in absolute silence. There were no rallying speeches, no official farewells, not even an announcement of the mission. Only a very limited number of officials knew what was about to happen that night. As for the world, everything seemed perfectly normal, but in reality, one of the most dangerous covert operations in history had already begun. The mission begins. On the evening of April 24th, 1980, American transport planes took off, carrying elements of the Delta Force and support units. At the same time, 8 RH-53 helicopters took off from a U.S. aircraft carrier in the Arabian Sea, heading toward a rendezvous point deep inside the Iranian desert. The planes and helicopters had to fly hundreds of kilometers in near-total radio silence while avoiding detection. In those moments, everything was going exactly as planned, but that did not last long. The first warning sign. Shortly after entering Iranian airspace, one of the helicopters began experiencing a technical issue. The crew reported a malfunction that made continuing the flight highly risky. The difficult decision was made: turn back. That was the first helicopter out of the operation. It wasn't ideal, but it wasn't catastrophic just yet. The original plan included a margin that allowed for the loss of one helicopter. The remaining helicopters pressed on, but the desert was hiding another surprise: the wall that wasn't on the maps. As the helicopters advanced deep into Iranian territory, A massive cloud of dust and sand loomed ahead of them. It wasn't just an ordinary wind. It was a dense sandstorm known locally as a haboob. Within minutes, the features of the landscape vanished. Visibility dropped to near zero. The sky turned a dark, eerie brown. Sand found its way into the engines and navigation systems. The pilots were flying blind, seeing only a few meters ahead of them. No one knew when the storm would end, or if it would get worse. They had only two choices: keep going or turn back. Most of them decided to push through, but the price began to show very quickly. One malfunction after another inside the storm, another helicopter began suffering from mechanical failure. The crew kept flying as long as they could, but the indicators were deeply concerning. After a quick assessment, another decision was handed down. This helicopter would not be able to complete the mission, and just like that, the force was down to only 6 helicopters. This was the absolute minimum required to execute the plan. Any further complication would be enough to abort the entire operation. Even so, everyone pressed forward. No one wanted months of meticulous planning to go to waste over a series of mechanical failures. Reaching Desert 1. After long hours of flying, the American aircraft began arriving one by one at the rendezvous point in the heart of the desert. The place was completely pitch black. No buildings, no villages, no sign of life whatsoever. But even here, things did not go as planned. While securing the perimeter, a civilian bus carrying a number of Iranian civilians appeared, crossing the desert road. Its presence was entirely unexpected. The forces stopped the bus and temporarily detained the passengers so they wouldn't compromise the secrecy of the operation. Shortly after, a fuel truck appeared. When it tried to change its route, it caught fire, unleashing towering flames that could be seen from a great distance. Although the operation remained secret at that moment, these incidents heavily heightened the tension and pressure on the forces on the ground. The hardest decision. The commanders began calculating the situation. How many helicopters were left? Were they all operating efficiently? Could the mission still be carried out? During the inspection, a new problem surfaced. One of the 6 remaining helicopters was found to have a hydraulic system failure. It became glaringly obvious that it was unfit to complete the mission safely. At this point, the force no longer had the required number of helicopters. The plan dictated a strict minimum threshold that could not be crossed. The commanders sat debating in the dark of the desert. The hours were slipping away. Any further delay meant the approaching sunrise. In the end, the decision no one wanted to hear was made. Abort the entire operation. After months of grueling training, after thousands of kilometers of flying, after making it into the very heart of Iran, the mission was over, before a single soldier could even reach Tehran. But the real disaster had not yet struck. As the forces were preparing to withdraw, just one mistake happened, a mistake that would turn a failure into a tragedy, ensuring the name Operation Eagle Claw would be remembered in military history books to this very day. The explosion that ended the mission. The decision had been made. Abort the operation. The objective was no longer to rescue the hostages, but to get the soldiers out of Iran as quickly as possible. Despite the bitterness of the decision, everyone believed that the hardest part of the mission was behind them. But the reality was that catastrophe was only minutes away. A race against time. At Desert 1, everyone began preparing to leave. Darkness still blanketed the desert, but time was not on their side. Every minute of delay meant the approaching sunrise. With the first light of day, the American force could easily be detected. Therefore, the pilots began starting the engines, while the C-130 transport planes prepared for takeoff with the soldiers on board. In those moments, the site was a hive of activity. The roar of engines filled the desert. Sand kicked up in every direction. Visibility grew even worse due to the dust whipped up by the helicopters themselves. A single moment that changed everything. One of the helicopters was attempting to reposition itself in preparation for departure, but the dense dust made visibility near zero. The pilot was struggling to maintain his orientation. At the same time, ahead of him was a U.S. C-130 transport plane loaded with massive amounts of fuel. Then, in a split second, the collision occurred. The helicopter's main rotor struck the fuselage of the plane. Within seconds, a massive explosion erupted. The silent desert turned into a ball of fire. The helicopter was completely engulfed in flames. The fire then spread to the transport plane. The fuel inside it was enough to turn the site into an absolute inferno. Soldiers heard the roar of the explosion from miles away. Everyone watched as tongues of fire rose dozens of meters into the air. At that exact moment, the operation effectively ended. Seconds of chaos. There was no longer time to think. Soldiers began running away from the flames, while others tried to rescue whoever they could reach. But the heat was intense. The ammunition inside the aircraft began to cook off and explode. Approaching the crash site became near impossible. After a few minutes, the commanders realized that continuing any rescue attempts would put the rest of the force in jeopardy. The decision was painful, but inevitable. The losses. The explosion resulted in the deaths of 8 American servicemen. They were the first U.S. casualties of that operation. Additionally, a helicopter and a transport aircraft were completely destroyed, and a large amount of equipment was ruined. But the loss wasn't just human. With the rapid withdrawal, the forces were forced to leave 5 other helicopters behind in the desert, along with equipment, documents, and gear that could no longer be recovered. Hours later, Iranian forces arrived at the site. They found burned aircraft, intact helicopters left behind by the Americans, and a scene that revealed to the world that a massive covert operation had just taken place inside Iranian territory. Shock in Washington. In the United States, it was no longer possible to hide what had happened. President Jimmy Carter went on air to personally announce that the rescue operation had been aborted following an accident during the withdrawal. It was a massive shock to public opinion. The operation that was supposed to bring the hostages home had ended without freeing a single hostage. Worse, it left behind casualties and heavy losses. Images of the burning wreckage in the Iranian desert began spreading across newspapers and television screens around the world. But even though the operation ended in failure, its ripple effects did not stop there. Inside the U.S. Department of Defense, a comprehensive investigation began. How could a plan that took months to prepare collapse in this manner? Was the cause the sandstorm? Or the mechanical failures? Or was the problem much deeper than that? These questions would lead to radical changes in how the United States executes its special operations. As for the hostages, they were still inside the embassy, waiting for the end of a crisis that was far from over. The failure that changed history. As the sun rose the following day, plumes of smoke were still rising from the Desert One site in the heart of the Iranian desert. As for the American soldiers who survived the explosion, they were already on their way back, carrying with them a heavy sense of failure. The mission was over, but its aftermath was just beginning. Shock within the United States. When the details of the operation reached Washington, a state of sheer disbelief took over. The problem wasn't just that the operation had failed. It was that it had failed before even reaching its objective. Not a single soldier had set foot in Tehran. Not a single hostage had been freed. In return, the United States lost 8 of its servicemen, in addition to aircraft, helicopters, and military equipment, in an operation that was supposed to remain entirely covert. For U.S. President Jimmy Carter, the blow was politically devastating. He publicly took full responsibility for the operation, announcing that the decision to execute it was his alone. But that did not stop the wave of criticism that swept across the United States. Many believed the operation exposed severe flaws in planning and coordination among the branches of the military. What was the real mistake? For many years, the question kept repeating. What brought down Operation Eagle Claw? Was it the sandstorm? Undoubtedly, it played a major role. It crippled the helicopters, exhausted the pilots, and blinded their vision. But subsequent investigations revealed that the problem wasn't just the weather. The operation itself was immensely complex. It relied on the flawless success of dozens of consecutive phases without a single error. Any minor malfunction, a delay of just a few minutes, or a defect in one aircraft, was enough to halt the entire mission. Furthermore, the participating forces belonged to different military branches and were not accustomed to executing joint operations of this scale and complexity. Because of this, many experts concluded that the operation exposed an urgent need to revamp how special operations are commanded and coordinated. The birth of a new era. It might seem strange, but sometimes the greatest defeats are the beginnings of the greatest changes. Following Operation Eagle Claw, the United States began a comprehensive review of its special operations capabilities. Joint training among forces was heavily upgraded. Transport, planning, and communication systems were improved, and more integrated command structures for special operations were established. The message was clear. This failure would never happen again. Over the following years, the fruits of these reforms became evident in special operations that became highly coordinated and deeply reliant on joint planning. And what about the hostages? As for the American hostages, they were not rescued by a military operation. Negotiations dragged on for several more months until an agreement was reached, leading to their release on January 20th, 1981, after 444 days of captivity. The crisis ended, but its impact did not. The relationship between Iran and the United States entered a new era of deep mistrust, remaining heavily shaped by the events of that period for decades to come. More than 40 years later, Operation Eagle Claw is still taught in military academies around the world, not because it was a victory, but because it became a vivid textbook example that military success does not rely on power alone. You might possess the best soldiers, the most advanced equipment, and the most precise plans, but when nature, time, logistics, and coordination collide, the outcome can completely change. Perhaps Operation Eagle Claw was not merely a failed attempt to rescue hostages. Instead, it was a moment that exposed the limits of military might, proving that even the most ambitious plans can collapse under a chain of factors that seem insignificant at first. More than 4 decades later, the charred wreckage left in the Iranian desert still reminds the world of that night. The night the world's most powerful military entered the heart of the desert, believing everything was under control, only to emerge carrying one of its hardest lessons. And though the hostages eventually returned home through negotiations, the political wound left behind by the crisis never fully healed. Perhaps that is why, whenever tensions escalate between Iran and the United States, the name Operation Eagle Claw resurfaces once more. As a reminder that history never truly vanishes, it casts its shadow over the present, and understanding what happens today sometimes begins by looking back at a single night that changed everything. More than 4 decades have passed since Operation Eagle Claw ended in failure, yet its impact continues to echo through history. It reshaped military strategy, changed the future of U.S. Special Operations, and became another chapter in the long and complicated relationship between the United States and Iran. History has a strange way of repeating itself, and sometimes understanding today's headlines begins with uncovering the stories that happened decades ago. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to discover more real stories filled with mystery, history, and untold secrets, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our next investigation. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.